Hi, and welcome to New Trends in Cyber Incident Response and Forensics, a webinar by LMG Security. My name is Jessie Thompson, and I will be your moderator for today. Our presenter for today is Matt Durrin. Matt Durrin is the Director of Training and Response for LMG Security, a Black Hat instructor, and the co-author of the upcoming book, Ransomware and Cyber Extortion. A seasoned forensics professional, Matt specializes in incident response, ransomware cases, cryptojacking, and banking Trojans. He regularly conducts cybersecurity webinars and seminars for hundreds of attendees in all sectors, including banking, retail, healthcare, government, and more. Matt holds a bachelor's degree in computer science from the University of Montana and previously worked as a blue team field technician system administrator for over 10 years. His malware research has been featured on NBC Nightly News. Matt, I'm passing you control of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Jessie, and thank you everyone for joining today for our New Trends in Cyber Incident Response and Forensics webinar. I'm really excited that we get to bring this to you because this is all of the kind of aggregate data that we've been working with over about the last, about 18 months or so, and the ability to put it all together into one kind of continuous educational opportunity like this, I think, is a very valuable piece of information for you to have. One of the big things that we really want to impress during the course of this webinar, and you'll see what we mean by this as we kind of go through, is the fact that hacking really is an arms race. This is an industry that is growing leaps and bounds over itself over the last few years, and it is very quickly outpacing what we used to consider to be normal activity inside of a cyber incident landscape, or something along those lines. The statistics from over the last 18 months or so, which we just got our 2021 statistics finally hammered out, are very telling about where the industry is headed and where we as defenders and investigators really need to be putting our focus so that we can keep up with the ever-evolving landscape that cyber criminals are constantly responsible for changing while they're out there. 2021 stats are out, as I just mentioned. There's a couple of great reports if you have the inkling to go out and read them. The Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, which LMG contributes to, is a great source of information on what common reported cybersecurity incidents look like, what the common attack tactics and what the common procedures were that attackers were using to take over networks. We have the Mandiant M Trends report, which again is just a comprehensive list of some of the bigger cyber attacks that have taken place over the last year or so, and what the really notable elements of those attacks kind of look like. We have the State of Cyber Resilience from Marsh and Microsoft. We have CrowdStrike's Global Threat Report, and a lot more. So we'll be using some information from these, plus some of LMG's information, to really kind of put into perspective what the last year has looked like and what that means for us moving forward, and how we can secure and again investigate networks if there is an issue that does come up. So today's roadmap is pretty straightforward. We're going to go through our new response trends and the changing threat landscape. So how things have shifted over the last few months or so, away from what we consider to be the traditional methods of entry that attackers were using getting into networks. We'll go over mass zero-day exploits, including things like Log4j, which, if you recall, basically set the internet on fire when it came out. We'll go through supply chain incidents like SolarWinds. We'll talk about malware-free attacks and detection strategies. So this is something that we're seeing as a trend, which we'll get into here in just a little bit. But the move away from using malware specifically to infiltrate and execute malicious activities on networks is something that we see as a pretty consistent upward trend over the last about 18 months or so. And if you're not looking for that kind of usage, if you're only looking for malware, then there's a really good chance you're probably going to miss something like that hitting your network. From there, we're going to go through incident notification trends, since those are evolving very, very rapidly. And then at the end, we'll go through our top 10 takeaways for the new trends in incident response and forensics. So first off, let's talk about initial infection vectors, and this is for the year 2021. When we are looking at the top ways that attackers were getting into networks, were getting that initial foothold that would allow them to expand and do something heinous like detonate ransomware or steal data or something like that. This is really how they were getting in, and this is coming from the Mandiant report specifically. 37% of the large-scale cyber incidents that Mandiant reported on specifically were the initial result of an exploit somewhere in this system. So either a firewall VPN exploit, software exploit, something along those lines. And we're seeing this as a much more relied upon tactic for adversaries out there, as they are a lot harder to defend against. We'll talk about why that is here when we start talking about our 0 days. Next up, we have about 17% of the attacks that were listed coming as the result of a supply chain compromise. We'll go into detail on this one as we go through, but supply chain compromises, just like 0 days and other exploits, are very, very tough to defend against, especially if you are not 100% certain exactly what software and what dependencies you have running inside different portions of your environment. We all have to deal with shadow IT staff every once in a while. This is one of the reasons why that becomes such a big issue. Next up, we have 14% coming through from a prior compromise. So this is a network that was impacted by a cybersecurity incident at one point, and either the doors weren't all closed, something was left over inside the network, or they had data stolen that was then returned for a second round of extortion from a cyber criminal group. It does happen somewhat frequently. And then we have 11% of these coming from phishing, which is notable. In a lot of cases, we've talked about a primary delivery method for malware being phishing, or email phishing specifically. And we're seeing a trend away from that, and there are reasons behind that, which we'll, again, get into a little bit more detail with. But needless to say, the older methods of defending a network, the more tried and true methods of stopping spam emails and malicious documents from getting through, are becoming less effective as adversaries make this switch away from the more traditional means of network entry into these new, more difficult to defend against kind of attacks. All right, so first off, let's talk about critical vulnerabilities, because these are popping up all over the place. We're seeing them make the news. They are coming out in droves, and there is likely not going to be a big stop to this. The one that I want to point out on here specifically is the Atlassian Confluence zero-day vulnerability. So we saw this one come out. This was right at the very beginning of June. And there was a notice sent out that hackers around the world were actively exploiting an unpatched critical vulnerability in the Atlassian Confluence software system. It's a productivity software that a lot of organizations use. And we thought that looked really strange. And it occurred to me that right about a year ago, I was on a flight coming back from Dallas, Texas. And in the airport in Texas, I actually wrote up a community alert on a critical Atlassian Confluence vulnerability that attackers were using to drop ransomware in networks. As it turns out, there have been several of these vulnerabilities, and that's very common when we're looking at other software vendors. I mean, looking at vendors like QNAP, who make the news constantly for being hit by ransomware operators, make this kind of a flag in the ground, letting us know that this is something we really do need to take seriously. The other one we're looking at here is the Felina vulnerability, and this is another one of those kind of vulnerabilities that is really causing a lot of problems. Currently, there is no patch for Felina, and it's a remote code execution vulnerability that can be executed from a malicious document on a computer, but without having to go through the standard steps we associate with email phishing, having to open a Word document and enable content and all of that. In some cases, this Felina vulnerability, this code execution vulnerability, can be executed by just previewing a rich text format document in Windows Explorer. So very, very dangerous type of exploit to have out there. There are some steps you can take to defend against it. Again, we'll get to that here in a minute. But I would consider this to be a trend moving forward. So the first thing we need to think about when we come across one of these new critical vulnerabilities is, does this affect me? Am I going to be impacted by this if I don't take any action? And you need to be able to answer this quickly inside of your environment. We see almost immediate adoption of these critical vulnerabilities into attackers' playbooks, and as we'll talk about when we talk about Conti's playbook, these are scripted sets of attack techniques that are being delivered to large groups of affiliate cyber criminals. And so once we have these vulnerabilities available, they will almost immediately be exploited, or someone will at least attempt to exploit them. The way that we do this, though, is by inventorying our software and our assets. We need to understand what exactly is running inside of our systems, what programs we're using, what programs those depend on, as in the Log4j vulnerability that came out, and a lot more information. We need to have a really good view of what exactly is happening inside of our network, because if one of these vulnerabilities comes out, we need to be able to act quickly to either secure that device, take it offline, or restrict access to it, or patch it if there is an emergency patch available, which there may or may not be. As we mentioned before, hackers are fast when it comes to implementing these kind of toolkits. The exploitation of the Atlassian Confluence zero-day has increased 15-fold in the 24 hours between June 5th and June 6th. Microsoft, when their Exchange vulnerability came out, so proxy logon and proxy shell, we're seeing the number of hacked servers double every 2 hours. And by that kind of expansion of scope, this was going to hit a lot of those servers very, very quickly if we didn't take very quick action against that. We've also seen other advanced persistent threat groups that are directly distributing information on how to quickly take advantage of these zero-day attacks. So right now, when we're talking about Atlassian, ransomware is kind of the name of the game on this one. There is a couple of very specific groups. One of them is a Russian APT 28, I believe. who is actively exploiting this to drop web shells into networks and to then deploy ransomware. And we've talked about this before. Not all cybercrime is ransomware. However, a lot of cybercrime leads to ransomware, and this is a perfect example of how that happens. The attackers who are getting in the door we're not, as far as we can tell anyway, initially planning on deploying ransomware, but once you have that kind of access and that kind of spread, it kind of makes sense to do that. And we're, again, seeing that big ransomware threat all across the cybersecurity industry. In fact, it is one of the top threats in the landscape right now. We've seen a huge amount of attacks that are moving from the traditional ransomware of locking up systems and then forcing you to pay for a decryptor before you can gain access to them into just data theft. And you can see the graph in front of you. Ransomware attacks preventing access to companies or systems until ransom is paid. 71% of ransomware attacks had that component in them. 50% had a privacy breach, so that was the loss or theft of personal data. Employees working from home falling for phishing and social engineering attacks, we've seen a big bump in that. And all of this is providing other areas for cybercriminals to enter into your network. They're providing other venues that attackers can use that don't rely on those more traditional stolen credential style or brute force style entry methods. Ransomware is also very cheap to get into, as we've shown in our dark web webinars and a couple of our other ransomware response webinars. Getting into the position of a ransomware operator is a fairly light lift for a cyber criminal. They don't need to have a very deep technical expertise. They don't need to understand necessarily exactly what the software is doing. All they really need to do is go onto a dark web marketplace and buy a ransomware starter pack. These things are for sale all over the place. They range anywhere from $5 to $10 for the ransomware starter pack, all the way up to thousands of dollars for a very nice and maintained version. The one you see in front of you right now is from the Alpha Bay, which is one of, or used to be anyway, one of our favorite dark web marketplaces to visit for research. It's since been taken offline by an international coordinated law enforcement effort, but you can see exactly what we're talking about here. This is the 2022 ransomware starter pack. This is going for not that much money. It's going for about $100. And for a cyber criminal who could potentially get a couple or a few thousand, potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars out of a ransom because of the software, you get the idea that cyber criminals are pretty well motivated to drop that, very small initial investment to get into that. Another thing that we're seeing is, again, this formulaic, basically scripting of hacking. And Conti is, I think, the best example that we can put out there. Conti was is still a very large-scale ransomware group. They are notorious for large ransoms, multi-million-dollar ransoms, full network takeovers. They've been responsible for multiple ransomware attacks that have made the news, so you've likely heard them before. At the very beginning of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, however, the Conti operators, who are assumed to be Russian at this point, came out publicly in favor of Russia. And a researcher who was living in the Ukraine and had kind of infiltrated their group at that point took offense to that and released a bunch of their public information to the world for us to consume and to dig through and research. And this gave us a really interesting look behind the curtain at what a cyber criminal group actually looks like on the inside. We don't normally get this deep of a view of how their operations actually function. But because of this data leak, we were able to really get an idea that this organization does run as a large-scale professional organization. They have internal leadership structure. They likely have human resource departments. They go through hiring practices, multiple interviews for affiliates that want to join into the crew, and a lot more. We got about 60,000 chat messages. We got 150 cryptocurrency addresses, and then we got Jabber usernames and email addresses, which again was just a wealth of information. One of the bigger things that we got out of this, though, was the lack of information that we had about successful ransomware attacks around the world. And when we track things like ransom payments, we can only track through the cryptocurrency networks that are being used up to the point where we know that a cryptocurrency address is being used by a ransomware operator. If there is nothing to tie that address to a malicious actor, then we don't necessarily we can't necessarily include that in our overall figures. And at this point, we'd assumed that the Conti had made a couple $100 million in ransoms based on some tracking that was done by a couple of cryptocurrency research organizations out there. What we found out after their data leak, however, was there were multiple cryptocurrency addresses that were not included in those studies. And when it really came down to it, from April 21st of 2017 all the way up to February 28th of 2022, Conti had received 65,498 and some change Bitcoin. At today's value, at the value at that time, that came out to about $2.7 billion. So that by itself should give you an idea that we don't really have a lot of information about how these groups operate, especially when we're looking at these groups when their hacks don't get reported publicly. Not something that's not something that's going to be too huge of a roadblock, but definitely something we want to keep in mind. We're also seeing changes in how ransomware operators are actually, operating their businesses. Evil Corp is a great example of this. So Evil Corp was the ransomware group that was behind both the Davidoff botnet and a series of high-profile ransomware strains over the last couple of years. And Evil Corp is an officially sanctioned entity, meaning that the Office of Foreign Asset Control states that U.S. citizens cannot do business with them, meaning if they infect your network, you can't pay them a ransom. It's actually against the law for you to do that. Evil Corp has been trying to evade those kind of sanctions by switching up the kind of ransomware and malware that they use to try to avoid any kind of implication that they are the group behind the attack. In fact, recently we saw them start to deploy Lockbit ransomware, which Lockbit is a completely separate ransomware organization, but they were doing this because Lockbit had not been sanctioned yet. So the individuals behind Evil Corp wanted to continue on with their business, but because of these regulations were unable to do so. Now they're just kind of camouflaging themselves. So from a response standpoint, what that means for us is we really do need to be careful about who we're dealing with and what kind of actions we take to remediate these kind of situations. If we are considering paying a ransom, we need to be very, very sure that we're not paying off to a sanctioned entity or that there's some other kind of legal loophole that we're going to run into that's going to cause us problems down the road. The other thing that we have to talk about, again, is the lack of patching. So in a lot of cases, once a zero-day vulnerability is publicly released, if it's discovered by a security researcher or someone like that, then we would hope that there would be a patch available that would make it so the zero-day would not be such a big issue. That is not always the case, though, and patches aren't always deployed right away or even complete right away when it is time to deploy them. When we're talking about the Felina vulnerability for Microsoft, there is, as of the beginning of June, no patch for that vulnerability, and we're still working on exactly how to work around that type of hack. And again, the Felina vulnerability is a dangerous exploit on a Windows-based system that we really want people to be aware of. It does not require the same types of steps that a traditional spam email that would deliver malware would need. This can be run in protected mode. It can be run without enabling content. There are no macros in the document. It can also just be a rich text format or a rich text document that can trigger this kind of attack on a system. But again, it goes towards that big zero-day exploit trend, and zero-day exploits are kind of the new norm. We saw this reported through multiple news agencies over the last 18 months. Hackers are exploiting zero days more than ever before, and this is Mandiant and Google showing their 2021 spike in confirmed 0 days that were used in attacks, going from 30 in 2020, 32 in 2019, all the way up to 80 in 2021. And we assume that that's probably going to be higher on the list once we get the statistics in for 2022. One of the reasons that we see this as such a problem is how easy it is for attackers to actually get their hands on these vulnerabilities. Even if they're not something that a researcher has put out there, if there's not proof of concept code available on GitHub, which unfortunately there is for a lot of these, there are marketplaces that attackers can go to and simply buy 0 days. Here's an example of one called zeroday.today. This is a dark web marketplace that we've been keeping an eye on for a little while. And here is one of the original Confluence remote injection code vulnerabilities for sale on this website. And this is coming up on the 6th of July. There are also vulnerabilities that have not been publicly disclosed yet that are available here. And in a lot of these cases, these are being sold for a very high dollar fee to a very prominent cyber criminal group, mainly for the point of breaking into multiple systems at the same time and maximizing their return on investment. There's an entire infrastructure and ecosystem that functions under here that we need to be kind of prepared for. Now, 0 days are hard. We don't exactly know when these vulnerabilities are going to come out. We don't know how severe they're going to be. We don't necessarily know how we're going to fix them right when they come out, but we do need to be ready because, again, ransomware gangs are rich enough to buy these 0 days without them coming out first. And some of the times these are, $25,000, $50,000, $100,000. If a ransomware operator feels like they can get their money back from an exploit like that, they're likely going to do it. And if they're making enough money to afford that $100,000 payment, that's going to be a pretty big deal for them. We're also seeing a lot of 0 days observed in very popular software suites. So even Apple saw 95 confirmed 0 days in 2021. Microsoft had 118. Siemens had 141. I mean, you can tell that these are large-scale applications and systems that run in a lot of organizations around the country who are suffering from these large-scale 0 days, and it's again something that we need to watch out for. This is a screenshot we pulled from one of our hack forums, and big thanks to Derek Rowe and Brandon Kirkbright, our researchers, for finding this. this. But this is somebody who is actually asking if anyone has a proof of concept for a Pulse VPN VPN exploit. They have a budget of $25,000, and they're asking someone to provide them with this kind of information. And not long after this is posted, now this is being posted in 2021, we see a couple months later hackers actively exploiting a Pulse VPN vulnerability on organizations around the world. This bypasses multi-factor authentication. This allows for full remote code execution, and we were seeing this as again, a very solid way that attackers were gaining that initial foothold into networks. So how do we deal with something like a zero-day attack? How do we deal with an attack that we don't necessarily know is going to happen? We don't know when it's going to happen. We don't know which systems it's going to happen against. But what do we do in that case from a defensive standpoint? Well, the overall solution is fairly straightforward. And a lot of this comes down to general cybersecurity hygiene that we want everyone to be practicing anyway. But this is something to have in place. So deploy compensating controls. Make sure that you have a solution in place where you can remove something like that from your infrastructure and not completely tank your entire business. So can you disconnect it? Great, that's awesome. If not, can we include additional firewalls on that system? Can we change the configuration to redirect malicious traffic somewhere else? Can we put endpoint detection and response, or EDR software on that specific asset for some more careful and close monitoring? Also, are we going to get guidance on how to actually deal with these? CISA and Microsoft have given us some great workarounds for the Felina vulnerability, and they're usually pretty on the ball when it comes to providing remediation steps for these kind of issues. But we want to take those with a grain of salt. Also, you want to be aware of free utilities and what these free programs that are out there on the internet from unknown vendors might actually do to your system. They may fix a zero-day vulnerability, they may create one, they may just provide an attacker with a web shell access into your system. Be careful about that. An example that we can talk about with this one though is Log4j. And if you remember, Log4j was the vulnerability that set the internet on fire in December of last year. This was a big deal. And Log4j is just a small subsystem that is used in a lot of different applications. It's an error logging program that gets implemented into a lot of open source applications. Log4j by itself is an open source application. This was a component of many vendor products, and unfortunately, a lot of those vendors were not very quick to notify that this was actually a component of their system. We ran into a couple that were pretty much, the client was notified about it, the victim was notified about it, but it was weeks after the actual vulnerability had taken control. So with Log4j, what could attackers actually do? Well, attackers could do quite a bit with this one. They could execute commands remotely, they could steal credentials, they could move laterally from one system to another, they could install more malware, which is a lot of times the end goal for a lot of these attacks, and they could steal data. This gave a lot of leeway for attackers to do a lot of really gnarly things inside of networks. And this is kind of the basic timeline that we were looking at. The Log4j vulnerability was actually reported to Apache in November of 2021. There was a researcher who found the vulnerability and reported it to them. There were partial fixes that were issued in November and early December, but it didn't quite fix the problem. And beginning right at the very beginning of December, right on the 9th, we saw a weaponized exploit released as a zero-day vulnerability for Log4j. And almost immediately, a couple days later, we saw crypto miners and botnet operators immediately jump on this and start automatically deploying their software to multiple different victims around the world. LMG dealt with a few of these cases where we found evidence of the XMRig or the Monero miner malware. We also found the Mushtik botnet and a couple others that were in there. And this, again, just expanded out a little bit further. Once we got into a little bit further into December, ransomware operators started integrating this directly into their playbook. They knew that if they had this powerful of a vulnerability, if they had this almost guaranteed access to a system, then they were set. All they had to do was execute this very trivial to execute set of code or commands, and they were into the system. Conti was one of the first ones that we saw to develop a full Log4Shell or Log4j attack chain. We saw a couple of other China-based ransomware operators exploiting this vulnerability, and this was just the very beginning. Again, we saw the Mirai botnet make a recurrence here, which is amazing. If you're not familiar with the Mirai botnet, they hold a near and dear place in my heart because we actually used their software a few years ago in a camera hacking experiment in the LMG malware lab. and Scientific American wrote about us in there. So check that out if you get a chance to. But we saw the Mirai botnet make a comeback based on this Log4j vulnerability because this was so trivial to execute and because they didn't really need to do anything specialized to deploy their software. They were basically able to just walk in the door to anyone that was running this Log4j vulnerability. To this day, this vulnerability is still a problem. There are still pieces of software out there that are running the older versions of this logging software that are still being exploited actively at this point. The same with Exchange, the same with Confluence, the same with a bunch of others out there. So we need to be very careful about what exactly we're running on our network that might have this kind of available vulnerability. The way that we do that is by embracing the software bill of materials, or the SBOM. Now, in 2021, the White House put forward some guidance for the federal government in how to basically improve the security and the information sharing that was available between different federal agencies. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that Log4Shell and Log4j was such a big problem at that point in time. One of the big things that they brought out was the requirement for software bill of materials for any organizations that were doing business with the federal government at that point. And we assume this will likely make its way into the private market. In fact, it already sort of has, but we'll see this being a much bigger component in a lot of the big partnership deals that we're looking at. So an SBOM includes a bunch of stuff that is very valuable for you to know about your network. It includes things like open source software, it includes dependencies, packages, vendor agents, your development kits, your APIs, and much more. That way, if there is a downstream vulnerability that's discovered, something like Log4j, you have a reference for the software that you're running inside your environment where you can quickly tell if any of your software suites are going to be affected by this, whether it's the named software that's affected or just another component of it like Log4j. The other thing that we need to talk about is having an emergency patch plan. Now, patching in an emergency is never fun. It is never a desirable situation. I totally understand that. But we need to be able to at least make an attempt to do this if there is a patch out there. Problems that we run into are significant, though. The patch may not exist at all. It may not work. It might break things, which we see pretty frequently with Windows patches, unfortunately. Also, we need to be able to expect multiple updates. There may be an emergency patch that comes out, and then, like we saw with SolarWinds and with Exchange, multiple follow-up patches that are meant to address other identified issues that were kind of brought to light during the incident. And then we basically have to decide in advance: do we want to be an early adopter of this, or do we want to take some comparative measures to secure our system, allow for that software to be refined a little bit, and then include in our patch deployment plan? Either way, patches, we do need stinking patches. We need to be able to do this. We need to have plans in place in case we do have to, in an emergency, apply some software to our system and ideally not break it. Now, as we mentioned before with Log4Shell, this is still an actively exploited vulnerability. The headlines you see here are from April and May of 2022, so we're months after patches for Log4j were actually released. But there are groups that are actively utilizing this Log4Shell exploit to take over things like VMware Horizon servers. And if you haven't seen it, we actually have a video. Tom Pohl from our penetration testing team did a great example of how to basically take over a vCenter server using Log4j. We have, I think it's a 30-minute video up on YouTube, so go check that out if you haven't seen it. He walks through the entire process, and it's frighteningly easy to accomplish. There is not a lot of technical expertise that is needed in order to execute something like this. We also need to be looking at what vulnerabilities are currently being exploited out there. And CISA has created a really nice known exploited vulnerabilities catalog that anyone can access and see what the big vulnerabilities that are being utilized by hackers out there really look like, what the CVE is associated with it, when the vulnerability came out, and if there's patching available for it. Highly recommend you go and check that out and cross-reference any of the software or hardware that you're using inside your network to make sure that you're not unintentionally running a vulnerable system somewhere. All right, the other thing that we've seen is law enforcement intervention. This has been a big trend that has kind of taken a couple of strange turns over the last year and a half or so. One of the big ones that we saw was the law enforcement moving in and fixing exploitable servers without really authorization from the organization running that server. This really started with Microsoft Exchange Server with proxy login and proxy shell. We were provided with notice that a court out of, I believe, Texas had provided the FBI with the authority to break into these systems essentially and then patch the vulnerability so that nobody else could do it instead of them. There are some questionable ethics to that, which we can have a discussion with about that at some other time. But it does make us have to kind of take stock of how we're applying these in our own networks. So the FBI was attempting to provide notice to organizations that they were doing this for. Apparently did not always go that way. There are pros and cons to this, though. This does reduce the risk of hackers and ransomware, but if law enforcement is coming into your server and altering the configuration of that server, that can potentially destroy evidence. And if we don't have that evidence, we can't really investigate fully to see the full scope of an incident or something like that. It can also confuse investigators. If we're looking through log data and showing a bunch of different IP addresses that are coming in with these suspected malicious activities, we're not necessarily going to know right off the top of our heads what is a malicious IP address versus what's an FBI IP address. So there may not even be that big of a difference between them. The IP address that we see coming from or that we associate coming from the government may not be from an IP that is directly associated with them. So again, this can slow us down as investigators and can cause problems on the back end for us. There are also operational impacts. If something that law enforcement does breaks something inside of a system, if they're deploying an emergency patch for you, then what happens? How does IT first identify what the change was that was made, and then who's responsible for that? And then will this happen again? Are we going to see the law enforcement agencies entering into servers and fixing vulnerabilities? The answer to that one, we already know, is yes, because we've seen that with a couple of other different vulnerabilities out there. But well, actually, here's just the example of that. So this is from April of 2022. The FBI was going after a Russian group that was operating a piece of malware called Cyclops Blink. And the FBI was able to go in and actually remove the malware from servers for individuals that were infected by this. In a lot of cases, without the individuals knowing that someone had just come into their network. Now we bring this all up because it leads to another trend that we're seeing, and that's the concept of dwell time, of how often or how long hackers are staying inside of a network before they actually do any of their malicious activities. Previously in 2020 anyway, the dwell time, median dwell time was 24 days. So from the time an attacker actually gained their initial access into your network to the time that they kind of capped off the hack, where the ransomware was detonated or data was stolen or something like that, was looking at about 24 days. We've seen that drop in 2021 down to 21 days, and that's the median dwell time. But in reality, a lot of these attacks are getting a lot faster. Attackers are moving from initial compromise to exploitation very, very quickly in a high percentage of cases. In fact, we're seeing 0 to 7 days as the dwell time in right about 38% of cases in 2021. That's a significant uptick. And we still see a lot of really, really long dwell times. I mean, we're looking at about 5% of cases that were reported in 2021 that were 1,000 days of dwell time. So 3 years, 4 years of dwell time where an attacker had access to a network. Really what we're looking at, though, is that 2-week period. Most of or a high percentage of the attacks that we're looking at have a dwell time of about 14 days. So we want to make sure that we are able to, in that 14-day time period, catch these malicious activities, lock hackers out of the network, and make sure that we don't end up in a situation where we do end up having to do things like negotiate a ransom or recover data or something along those lines. The other thing that we're seeing as a trend is the introduction of multiple threat groups into hacked environments. In 2020, this has actually come down a little bit in 2021, but from 2019, it's a significant increase where when we come into a network and look at what actually happened, who the hackers were, what the malware was, we see evidence that multiple parties were involved at that point. It wasn't one specific group that gained initial access and then moved laterally and then deployed ransomware. It was a banking Trojan that gained initial access to the network. And then it was a secondary group that came in and actually did the lateral movement and established their foothold. And once they were done, they stole data and then turned the keys over to a ransomware operator who then came in and dropped ransomware and encrypted the network. Again, this is a very common attack chain that we're seeing, especially when we're talking about vulnerabilities, excuse me, and these critical exploits being involved. Once we start getting into this 0-day exploit territory, we start seeing a lot of different actors in these servers, and they may not be related to one another. A great one here is the 8220 gang. 8220 is a cryptocurrency mining cyber criminal operation. So they break into servers. They don't necessarily steal data or break systems or steal information or anything like that. What they really want is your hardware resources. What they want to do is drop their cryptocurrency miners into computers on your system, eat up all of your CPU bandwidth, and make themselves money. And they were doing this originally based off of Log4j, and now they're doing it based off of that Confluence bug that we were just talking about, that same 0-day that ransomware operators are using to deploy their malicious software. these cryptojacking gangs are also using to declare or to distribute theirs. And ironically, we're actually seeing a lot of, or not a lot of, but indications that there's like a battle going on between some of these cryptocurrency miners will actively scan a computer to see if there's any other active malware on the computer, delete that malware, close off the gate that those attackers were using, and then basically establish their sole control of the system. We saw the Mirai botnet kind of pioneer this kind of tactic, and we're seeing it again with a lot of these new ones. This goes towards motive, though. In a lot of cases, the attackers who are getting into systems are doing so for personal or financial gain. They are not doing this because they are trying to protest. They're not doing this to steal information for government purposes or for espionage. In most cases, for both large organizations and small to medium businesses alike, the goal is finances. Hackers want to make money. They want to do things as quickly as they can. They want to get as much return on their investment as they can, and then they're out the door. So again, something to keep in mind. Now, we talked a little bit about this when we started into the webinar, but one of the reasons why we want to have such a close view of our network and understand exactly what it is that we're running and how it operates inside the network is the fact that attackers are moving away from the older models of using actual malware. So in a lot of cases, if we are looking at someone gaining access to a network, well, they may have exploited the network or used an exploit on the network to gain that initial foothold. Once they're inside the network, they will either live off the land and use the tools that are already there, or they will just install their own IT management tools. AnyDesk is one that we see very frequently in Conti ransomware attacks and in Lockbit ransomware attacks. It's a remote monitoring and management software suite, similar to something like the Kaseya system. But attackers will use something like this because it's very unlikely to trigger antivirus. It's not a virus. It's a legitimate piece of software. It's something that IT departments use frequently around the world. And it also lets them kind of fly under the radar, not to make it too obvious that they're inside the network. Once they have this AnyDesk system installed, they have persistence established, and then when it comes time to actually deploy that ransomware, they can do so through that remote monitoring and management toolkit. The graph you see here is from CrowdStrike. This is from their global threat report. This is Q4 of 2021. 62% of the attacks that they noted were malware-free. There was no malware involved. They just used standard system toolkits, standard PowerShell commands, and other things that were readily available inside the system. Conti is, again, and we'll bring up Conti again in this one. Conti is one of those groups that we see as a big adopter of this kind of tactic. We got to see their playbook leaked last year. And inside of that, we had a huge list of the commands and applications that Conti would use when they broke into a network in order to identify sensitive data, in order to get it out of the network, and how to avoid antivirus software and expand that dwell time to make sure that they got everything that they wanted to really increase the the veracity of their cyber attacks. We saw them using things like NetScan. We saw them using things like ngrok. We saw them using things like rsync, standard IT toolkit items that would not necessarily be out of place except for how they were being used. So if we're paying attention to how things are being used, not just that they're there, then that's going to go a long way towards helping us. We'll talk about how we do that here in just a second. Okay, so now that we're through supply chain compromise and exploits, let's go into prior compromise. This is a big one that we see as a reoccurring problem for a lot of organizations. If you've suffered one cyber attack, especially a ransomware or cyber extortion attack, then you are at a higher risk for a secondary attack. And 14% of the cases that Mandiant reported over 2021 were that prior compromise. Either access was never fully cut off for the attacker, or access was gained and then basically sold off to someone else, and they're the ones that actually performed the hack. So how do we get around this? Well, the trick to this is threat hunting. And this should be a part of every security program's arsenal. Threat hunting is incredibly valuable when it comes to understanding exactly what's happening inside your network. Now, if you're not familiar with the term, threat hunting is a proactive, human-driven investigation of a network. We're not really relying directly on antivirus software. What we're looking at is the activity that's happening inside of a system. So we have some specialized tools that we'll use to do this. And we'll talk about what that is here in just a second. But really what we're doing is we're searching for very subtle indicators of compromise, things that wouldn't flag on a virus scan. We want to be able to find and eradicate persistent threats, long-standing persistent access to a network. And by doing so, we can identify those weak spots or those potential holes in our security system and close those up and prevent those repeat infections from coming through. Now, one of the biggest things that we use to facilitate this kind of activity is endpoint detection response software, or EDR software. There are a lot of different variations on this, but really what this comes down to is a couple of different capabilities that make it probably a little bit better than antivirus for most of the applications that we're referring to here. First off, this is going to be host-based. So we're going to be looking at what's happening on the computer systems themselves. We're going to get real-time continuous monitoring. We have live response capabilities, meaning we can go directly into one of those systems if it is behaving strangely, and we can remediate that system right away. We also have the ability to historically collect data on a network, and this can be really helpful for an investigator when we're trying to establish what normal activity on a system looks like. If we don't know what normal is, then we can't spot abnormal, and that's pretty straightforward process there, but it is really helpful for us to have that. These are also very highly automated. We can work through a lot of security orchestration and automation response tips on these. We can have direct responses to certain levels of detections inside the network pre-programmed into a lot of these pieces of software. Again, it is very handy. Now, we get asked the question very frequently, how is EDR different from antivirus? And really what it comes down to is how they operate. In most cases, or in a lot of cases, antivirus is going to be operating on a static scanning model. It's going to be looking for known bad software, so malware basically. It's going to be matching that based on either a quick heuristic detection or a signature-based detection. But the problem is that that indicates that the software really does have to be on the computer or make it to a computer before it can be detected. It's also not very efficient at detecting regular software that is just being used maliciously. So if your antivirus software runs across your computer and sees that AnyDesk is installed, unless you are specifically telling it to look for AnyDesk, it's probably going to gloss right over that. AnyDesk is a signed application. It's from a legitimate vendor. It's used as an actual IT toolkit, so antivirus probably isn't going to mess with it. EDR will likely get that program has been installed, but when we really talk about where you need to go with this, what's better, EDR or antivirus, we say why not both? In a lot of cases, newer EDR toolkits include antivirus software, and it's that best of both worlds kind of approach that we really want to be moving towards. In fact, EDR software by itself is kind of on the way out at this point in favor of a new type of software called XDR, Extended Detection and Response. And really what that does is take all of the things that EDR and antivirus do and include network detection along with that. Again, very, very handy to have around. Okay, so what to expect in mass zero-day exploits. These, again, are going to be something that we have to deal with somewhat frequently moving forward. There's really no way to gloss that over. This is what we really want to expect in terms of the timeline, or what we assume we're going to expect. So a new critical exploit is publicized. There may not be a patch available for it yet, but it is going to be quickly adopted by cyber criminal groups, as we see with something like the Confluence bug that's out there right now. These exploit kits are going to be either for sale or they're going to be offered for free on places like GitHub or on darknet forums. These are going to be almost immediately integrated into attacker playbooks, and they're going to be exploited very, very quickly. And then they're going to be used for a long time by hackers, because hackers know, as well as most others out there, that patching is a hard process in a lot of cases. It's not necessarily something that we can just jump right into. And there are organizations that may not even be aware that these vulnerabilities exist. So those are going to sit out there and be vulnerable until they are either taken completely offline or they are exploited by a hacker. Because of this, we need to plan our zero-day response. How do we plan for something that we really cannot plan for? Well, the first thing we need to do is inventory our software, as we said before, and embrace that software bill of materials. Understand exactly what we have running inside the network. We need to deploy compensating controls. We need to have an emergency patch plan ready to go in case we do need to take action. And then we need to prepare to threat hunt. We need to be able to identify if there's still something in the network that's going to cause us problems in the long term. All right. Supply chain compromise is the next one we're going to jump into here really quick. So what is a supply chain compromise, and how is this different from a zero-day? We get this question fairly frequently. A supply chain attack occurs when someone infiltrates your system through an outside partner or provider with access to your systems and data, and that's from Maria Korolov, who is from CSO Online. So the big thing that we're trying to say here is this is like a zero-day attack that you really don't have control over. That's kind of what it ends up looking like in a lot of cases, especially when we're talking about something like Kaseya or like SolarWinds or something like that. If there's limited visibility or management on a system, if we don't actually really have the keys to that system, and that's the system that ends up being compromised, that puts us in a pretty bad position. This also goes towards where these attacks are being targeted over basically the full landscape. So if we're looking at the percent of investigations that are done for cybersecurity incidents, large portion of those go to business and professional services. High-tech services, though, are not far behind. And high-tech services are where a lot of these supply chain incidents actually originate from. If we're talking about, again, remote management software or remote access software, something like that can be hit with a potential bug that is in use by a large number of different organizations, then we will likely see something like this. So in this case, we have a couple examples. So this is the Goodwin Breach. This is a large-scale law firm that was hit with a big data breach. We also saw Jones Day hit by a big vendor data breach. Both of these were because a a component of their infrastructure was compromised in one of these supply chain attacks, and that was used to actually enter into the network. We also see the city of Chicago's emails were stolen by the hack of an outside law firm. So these can have large far-reaching ripple effects that affect a lot more than just your organization or just the organizations that are using those pieces of software. And we'll talk about how that goes here in just a minute. So here's a good example of that when we were talking about the far-reaching effects of these kind of incidents. We'll go back in time to the Excellion attack, and if you're not fully familiar with that story, Excellion was an organization that produced a piece of hardware called the Excellion FTA, or File Transfer Appliance. And ironically, this was a piece of hardware that was built to safely transfer documents in between organizations that handle sensitive information. A group of ransomware operators by the name of Cobalt were able to exploit these systems, gain access to them, and steal multiple terabytes of very, very sensitive data. And we're now starting to see data breach notifications from some of these companies, like Flagstar Bank is a great example of because of this vulnerability. This was an older, kind of outdated piece of hardware that was still technically being supported by Excellion, but the patching for it was slow, and there were multiple vulnerabilities that were associated with it. Another good example is TrialWorks. Now, if you're not familiar with TrialWorks was a hosting system that was used by a lot of law firms around the country, and they suffered a ransomware incident where all of the data that was being hosted in their platform was taken offline. This is bad news if you're an attorney and you're doing court or have paperwork to fill out, because none of the information that you need to do your job can be accessed now. These things were in a lot of cases held exclusively inside of TrialWorks. They were relied upon for consistent access to this kind of data, and when they went down, it caused a massive disruption. Court cases had to be moved, deadlines were missed. There was a lot of bad that happened because of this, and obviously if we're dealing with the legal industry, we can assume that there's probably going to be some litigation that came out of this one too. Cloud vendors are not immune from this either. Blackbaud is another great example of this. They were the world's leading software company for non-profit organizations around the world. They were hit with a ransomware attack. In that ransomware attack, they decided to actually pay the attacker to delete the data. They didn't want the attacker to hang on to that, and they got some kind of assurance that the data had actually been deleted from the attacker side. But the problem was Blackbaud didn't really have a great inventory of what exactly that data was. They provided a platform for other organizations to store their data in, but they didn't really have a lot of policing controls to make sure that there was not sensitive information like social security numbers, payment information, financial information, anything like that in the overall system. This led to a lot of the organization's users having to basically perform their own data breach investigation because Blackbaud was affected in this manner. And we saw a lot of fallout from that. So we saw the Bush Presidential Center, we saw the Boy Scouts, Texas Tech, University of Texas, Austin, and a huge number of other organizations affected by this. And this was basically the emergency investigation they had to do. And emergencies are never the time when we want to be doing these things. If we're doing an inventory of data, if we're doing an inventory of hardware, we don't want it to be because we just got hit with a ransomware attack. They're extremely expensive to do, especially if you're having to throw everything together at the last minute. This can also lead to missing things that are in your network if you're trying to rush through this. Because remember, if we inventory, we want to get everything. We want all the workstations and servers, cloud applications, internal applications, home computers, remote access points, everything. We also want this basically done by qualified people. So if we have to bring in trained consultants and attorneys to do this in a rush, sometimes after hours, that's only going to add to the cost of this. And again, the tally becomes pretty huge. So this is a small list, not a comprehensive list, but a small list of organizations that were affected by Blackbaud. We see Innova Health with over 1 million individual records affected, Northern Lights Health, 657,000 individual records affected, St. Luke's, Multicare, the University of Florida's health clinic. There's many others on there. You get the idea, right? So this is, again, really just an indicator of how big of a problem this can be. We also want to make sure that because something like this might happen, we include those key suppliers in our response planning. So if there's a problem with a service that we're using like Blackbaud, what do we do about that? How do we get data so we can determine what actually happened inside of our tenant? Does that data even exist? Do they have logs of our actual activity inside the network? And then who covers the cost of investigation if their client is responsible for the loss of my data? So it comes down to a lot of questions that need to be established ahead of time with your trusted security vendors. Another one that we like to bring up in this case is SolarWinds. SolarWinds was a huge hack. This happened back in 2020, right at the end of 2020. And this came out as basically a notification that the Orion software that SolarWinds used for network monitoring had been actually hacked since about September of 2019. There were 18,000 potential customers that had been exposed to a poison packet that had been included with the overall software. and had not been notified for over a year. This is a lot of time for attackers to be in networks, to dwell, to steal data, to get a lay of the land, to watch conversations. That is, again, going to cause a lot of problems. So how do you plan for something like that, especially if it's something that you're using to monitor your network that ends up being the culprit for your attack? There's a lot that we can talk about there. But what could attackers do once they were inside the network? Well, again, as with some of the other big vulnerabilities we've seen, the list was fairly comprehensive. They could steal files, they could install new software, they could gather network information, they could reboot systems, they could disable other security controls that were included in the network. Just again, on a short list, here are some of the organizations that were affected by that SolarWinds hack. So we have Microsoft, we have AT&T, we have Credit Suisse, MasterCard, Visa, Ford. These are large organizations that are in a lot of different facets of everyday life for a lot of people around the country. When it really came down to it, we saw a disproportionate shift towards information technology and government being the primary targets for this. And again, that just has to do with where SolarWinds software ends up. So the big thing here is that SolarWinds did not detect this malware. FireEye was actually the organization that detected this malware inside their own network when their SolarWinds server was finally discovered to have been compromised. FireEye came out and did a public notification before SolarWinds did. SolarWinds came out afterwards and said basically that they confirmed that the attack had happened. But it was a big thing. This was 9 months after this backdoor had been fully rolled out, 15 months after the original hack, and a lot of very sensitive information was potentially at risk here because there was not a lot that we could do to remediate this kind of a cyber attack. So how do we get our feet under us in something like this, something like SolarWinds that can hit us really hard and fast? Well, the key there is to monitor threat intelligence, and there are multiple sources out there that are just absolute wealths of information for what's happening in cybersecurity right now. And you want to take a look at these. So the ones you see in front of you right now, this is the Vmware Carbon Black Threat Research Center. This is a great piece of information to have at your fingertips if you need to. They provide indicators of compromise. They tell you when exploits or when certain activities were originally shown. And if you're using certain types of software, including the Carbon Black EDR toolkit, they'll give you ways that you can search your network and actually determine if you've been impacted by this. There's also CrowdStrike, there's Critical Stack, there's also cybersecurity news organizations out there, which you can see we rely on for a lot of this information when we put these presentations together. Organizations like Bleeping Computer, ZDNet, the Wall Street Journal are all great sources, but take their information with a grain of salt and make sure that you always verify what you're reading. Timing trends are also big here. So when we're talking about deployment of malicious software like ransomware, we can use the Kaseya attacks as a great example of that. This happened on the 4th of July weekend last year. And this was what we like to call a forensics Friday. This is something that we get to very, very frequently. As soon as business starts to close on the East Coast, our phones will traditionally start ringing. And that's because attackers know they will have a much higher level of success if they attack when the network is not fully in use. So when we're talking about when the actual malware detonates on a network, in about 76% of cases, it gets executed on weekends or outside of work hours. If we are spending a bunch of money on security software and services to keep our network secure, we need to make sure that we are monitoring in those off times because that's when a lot of this stuff is going to happen in the first place. We also need to conduct response training. We need to make sure that our staff understands exactly how to respond in the case of an incident. So how do we preserve evidence? How do we triage a situation? How do we quickly contain? And more importantly, how do we get ourselves into a position where we can secure our network, but we don't completely trample the entire thing so an investigator can't come in behind us and actually figure out what happened? Another great way to go about this is tabletop exercises, which are one of my personal favorite types of exercise to do with LMG. It's like running a Dungeons and Dragons game, but with cybersecurity. I know I sound like a huge dork for saying that, but really that's what it is. What we can do with tabletop exercises is simulate a cybersecurity event with your team. And this can be your executive staff, it can be your security team, whoever needs to be involved. We can go through things like ransomware, cyber extortion, business email compromise, financial loss, malware, and a lot more. Really what we try to do with these, though, is test processes and communications. Identify gaps in your response policies early on so those can be adjusted, those can be altered to better work for your individual environment, and then we can align expectations and identify any other problems that we see. And these are oftentimes fun and educational events to put together for people. We really do have a good time doing them. So if you haven't done a tabletop before, or if you haven't done one in a while, we highly recommend checking it out and seeing if you can integrate that into your security training plan. It takes about a day to put it together, and they are immensely valuable. We also have technical training for first responders. So if you have not taken it before, LMG offers a cyber first responder class taught by myself and Sherri Davidoff, our CEO. We actually have a class coming up on July 28th. right before we head off for Black Hat. So if you're interested in getting a leg up on modern incident response, we highly recommend checking that one out. We give you hands-on lab access for 90 days to let you actually go and practice using some of these tools. It's a really fun class to put together. The next thing we want to do is preserve evidence. So preserving evidence takes time, but it is very important for us to do. We want to make sure that we actually have this information available. So in the case that we do need to investigate, we have good, sound data we can use to make those conclusions. So this is especially important when we're talking about something like the SolarWinds hack, which had a very, very long dwell time that was unknown. If we are not preserving evidence for an extended period of time, if we only have 30 days worth of data and a hack has lasted for 15 months, we're not really going to be able to get a great picture of what actually happened. So something that we want to impress here. Also, we want to talk about bringing in the cyber insurer, breach coaches, forensics teams, whoever you have available to advise on how this should be done. And EDR software, if you have it in your network, like CrowdStrike or Carbon Black, can actually help with this kind of preservation. Something that we want to again impress on you. This is actually becoming a big deal for the federal government, especially after SolarWinds. There are directives that require the preservation of data in very specific ways. So forensic preservation of hard drives, for instance, is something that we'll see in a lot of cases. If you're not trained on how to forensically preserve a hard drive, you may not do it correctly and you may not meet the requirement to preserve that data. So just something to keep in mind. All right, so the other thing that we want to really point out here in terms of why threat hunting and why this kind of continued analysis is so important is that pulling the plug on something might not actually save you. If we're talking about something like the SolarWinds attack or the Microsoft Exchange server attacks, yes, that was the original way that attackers got into the system, but in very few cases did they just stay there. What attackers will oftentimes do is establish a much more persistent level of access in your network. And a lot of times that comes with moving to other computers that are not something that's going to be necessarily scrutinized in the case of an event. We also see the use of, again, legitimate software to create these points of entry into the network. Cobalt Strike is a great example of that. Cobalt Strike is a penetration testing toolkit that is being used by a lot of hackers to establish that persistence and move between networks. And again, it's very tough to detect. So if you're not specifically tuned to detect Cobalt Strike on your network, you might not see it with your traditional antivirus software. The stealthy backdoors are also something we run into on systems very, very frequently. What you see here is a PowerShell command that is grabbing a piece of malware from a web server and installing it on a computer. In fact, this is about the execution history we see when we are looking at a malicious Word document executing on a system. Word will open PowerShell. PowerShell will execute an encoded command, grab malware, install on the system, and there it is. Antivirus software might not catch this. EDR software probably will. This is a screenshot from Carbon Black that we're showing right here. So how do you know what to look for? Well, malware that's designed to avoid detection is tough to find. In the case of SolarWinds, this one had a 12 to 14 day sleep timer, so it had about 2 weeks between any of its active periods, at least in the very beginning. But other than that, there are some other anti-analysis techniques that we can get around if we're prepared to do so. So verifying specific names of data link layer files on a computer, delaying execution until later phases. We can compensate for that if we know what to look for, and those threat intelligence sources that we work with are a great source of information for that. All right, so remember to have an emergency patch plan. Again, this is a big part of your overall cybersecurity response. We want to make sure that this is taken seriously. Also, expect a lot more fallout over time. The SolarWinds hack is still coming back to haunt us at this point. We understand that Microsoft will likely have the same thing, and Log4j will be with us probably for the rest of eternity. Let's just be real about that one. All right, so this moves us into our final wrap up here, new incident reporting requirements. So cybersecurity regulations were actually signed into a law recently, which is one of the first times we've seen a wide overarching federal cybersecurity law go into place. This was included as part of the Budget Act, and this is the Cybersecurity Reporting Act of 2022. This applies to critical infrastructure, so this is infrastructure that is deemed as critical to the operation of the country. Some substantial cyber attacks or ransom payments need to be reported almost right away. So incidents need to be reported within 72 hours. Ransom payments need to be reported within 24 hours, and other countries are following suit on this as well. There's also a requirement to preserve evidence. Right now, we're seeing a big trend in privacy laws popping up all over the country. So what you see on the screen here are states that either have privacy laws that are in development or are already in place, and they're different in every state. So we need to be cognizant of where we are and what our responsibilities actually look like. We also need to update our incident response plans for this kind of notification. So who is going to notify? Are we up to snuff with the regulations that are in place? are we going to meet these actual kind of deadlines? I know we're coming right up on the 1 o'clock hour here. We've got just a couple minutes left, and then I'll stay a few minutes extra if there are any questions, but just to give you guys a quick heads up. All right, so when we're talking about these reporting requirements and the penalties that are associated with them, proactive measures can actually reduce the fines and penalties that are associated with these new kind of policies. So the HIPAA Safe Harbor Act was signed into law in 2021. That allows for the consideration of mitigating factors and cybersecurity measures that were put into place 12 months or so prior to a breach when they're considering fines and enforcement. So if you are, if you're thinking about dragging your feet on implementing those specific kinds of software suites, don't wait. Get those in place as quickly as you can, because even if you get hit by an attack in a year or so, there may be some compensating controls you can lean into, at least lessen the negative fallback from regulatory agencies at that point. We also want to look for qualifying cyber insurance. So qualifying cyber insurance is something that needs to be maintained by the organization, and qualified is something that is a term that means whether or not your insurance actually meets the requirements of the programs that you're associated with. So we need these for data breach investigations, legal services, notification costs, ransom payments, and a lot of other kind of back-end features of a cybersecurity incident that organizations don't really think of right off the top when they're considering. Your cybersecurity insurance can be a huge partner when it comes down to this. They can be a great advocate for your organization, and they can really help make things a lot smoother getting from that initial detection up to a full remediation point. All right, so trends are pretty straightforward here. Software vulnerabilities are rampant. We're going to see these continue to move forward. We're going to continue to have to deal with them. It's going to happen, so we just need to be prepared for them. Supply chain hacks are on the rise and will likely continue to move that way. Malware-free attacks are also trending. Again, that makes perfect sense when we look at how antivirus software has evolved and how attackers are now evolving their tactics to get around that kind of software. And incident notification laws are maturing. We're likely to see some significant changes on cybersecurity incident reporting, not just in the US, but worldwide over the next year. And some of those may be it may be significant to our industry specifically, that we now have these very serious deadlines and timers that we need to be able to hit in order to meet those regulations and requirements. All right, top 10 takeaways for the presentation for today. Inventory your software and assets. Understand exactly what you have inside your network and what needs to be done to protect it. Monitor threat intelligence so you can understand when new attacks are coming out, how severe they might be, and what you can do to identify if you've been a victim of that attack. Deploy compensating controls. Make sure that you have additional means of containment available inside your network. Make sure that you preserve evidence, or at least know a cybersecurity firm who you trust to preserve evidence for you. Have an emergency patch plan in place. Prepare for threat hunting. Make sure that's a part of your cybersecurity plan. And then make sure that you're including key suppliers in your response planning. This is going to be huge, especially when it comes down to third-party applications that may be operating inside your environment. Response training and tabletop exercises, again, should also be added into your general security playbooks as part of your security program every year. And all of this will help you plan for these elevated risks, which you do need to be prepared for at this point. And then once we have all of that done, we update our response policies and procedures to make sure that everything is on the level and ready to go in the case that we do, unfortunately, need to invoke those. Okay, that is it for me. Thank you so much for joining, and apologies for going a couple minutes late here. Again, my name is Matt Durrin. I'm with LMG Security. If you have any questions whatsoever, I would love to hear from you. Please feel free to reach out. You can get me at info@lmgsecurity.com. You can give us a call. You can find us on Twitter @LMGSecurity. Find us on LinkedIn. And remember, if you're interested in incident response or any of the other fun things that go along with that, check out our Cyber First Responder class on July 28th. It's a great single-day boot camp on how to be that first responder in a cybersecurity incident, and we're really proud of it. All right, Jesse, I will turn it over to you if there are any questions. We'll stick around for a couple of minutes.
Great, thanks, Matt. We did have one question, and it is, how does the national reporting law affect private businesses?
That is a great question. So the national reporting law, I think we're seeing as kind of the initial step towards a more kind of cohesive cybersecurity reporting framework for the country. Right now, critical infrastructure is the big one that's affected by this reporting law, but I don't see that staying that way for very long. There is definitely a benefit to enforcing those kind of I guess higher significance types of reporting deadlines. And I think we'll start seeing this integrated more into the private industry, not necessarily in the form of government regulation, or at least probably not right off the bat, but probably more in the form of contractual obligations between partners. So trusted vendors and trusted partners will likely include notification requirements for cybersecurity incidents inside their teaming agreements, or something along those lines. I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see where this goes. We're in kind of a flux in terms of how the laws are put together at this point, and we'll get to an endpoint here eventually, but how we get there is going to be kind of a twisting road, I would assume.
Okay, great. Those were the questions that we had, or the questions. So thank you again, Matt. Again, my name is Jessie Thompson with LMG Security. We'd like to thank everyone who attended. So thank you all and have a great day.